Good evening. My name is Mike. We're going to be talking about church history. And I want to start out the class. I'm not going to do a lot of teaching tonight. It's a lot of introduction about what we're going to be talking about when we talk about church history. And I have people ask me all the time. They say, what value is church history? Do I really need to do, or do I really need to study church history? And the answer, quite honestly, is this. You can live your life and do perfectly well and know absolutely nothing about church history. You don't have to study church history, but there is a benefit to looking at what has happened over the years in the history of the church. And the benefit is this: there's a lot of mistakes that have been made over the years in church. I mean, if you've ever been involved in church, you know we make mistakes all the time. We make mistakes in how we deal with people. We make mistakes with how we make decisions. We make mistakes with how we look at the Bible a lot of times. So there are a lot of mistakes that have been made in church. And the whole idea behind understanding church history a little bit is to get the idea of where did we come from? How did we get to the spot that we're in right now? The other benefit to church history is saying, all right, back then a whole bunch of mistakes were made. We did this wrong, so now we're coming up to the same kind of situation. Let's not make the same mistake. So the first part when we're talking about church history is the whole basis of why is it a good idea to even study history at all? And the answer to that, put simply, is this: that studying history allows us to look back at what we did well, what we did wrong, and to plot our course for the future to say, hey, listen, we're going to learn from what went well. We're going to look back at what went wrong and how we made mistakes, and we're trying to avoid making those mistakes again. My profession, where I earn my money, is as a land surveyor, and there's all sorts of, I guess, illustrations I could use for how you do land surveying when you're looking at how you chart your course in history, because you learn how to chart your path in surveying by having a long backside to look back on. You occupy a known point while you're looking at your backside, and then you tangle, you understand, and you go a distance to chart your path and go to a known point. It's the same thing with history. What we're doing right now is we're sitting on top of a point in time at this moment, and we can look back at where we used to be back in history, and we can say, okay, from that we've learned this, and we can turn an angle and chart our course for the future and say we aren't going to make the same mistakes, and we're going to draw from the wisdom of the people that have been ages in front of us, as they charted, or as they made their way through history, as they started working through establishing a church organization, as they worked through how to deal with people in organizations, and as they looked at how they interpret the Bible and how that intersects with culture. And what we're going to talk about throughout this course, and I'm going to prime you, because one of the things we're going to do is I'm going to ask Scott to come up, because Scott and I have a different view on a couple points in history. And I'm going to give you a primer on it. There's a guy, if you want to study ahead, there's a guy whose name is Constantine. And he was a major division point in church history. Before Constantine, it was one way. After Constantine, it was another way. And a lot of people look at Constantine the Great and they say Constantine was great. He was a good influence on the church. He did a lot of good for it. And we should really be thankful, and we should learn all the good points that came out of Constantine. There's other people that say, no, what actually happened under Constantine is bad stuff. And we're still reaping the benefits of what bad things happened under Constantine. And we need to avoid the things that happened under Constantine the Great. Now, I come from the standpoint that Constantine was a bad deal. Scott comes from a perspective that Constantine was a good deal. So I'm going to be asking him to come up, and at one point in this class, we're going to have a discussion, like a round table between two people, bringing up the good and the bad points of Constantine the Great. And we let you make up your mind which you want to land on that particular issue. So that's one of the things we're going to do. The other thing we're going to do in this class is we're going to go ahead and we're going to, every day after I start getting into the outline of this course, I'm going to give you a quiz. And I will go through the quiz. It'll be up on the screen. You can write it down. If you call in or you email into to the course, to the website, and Scott will give you the website at the end of this class. You can send me your email, and I will email you a copy of the quiz. Because what I want to do is I want you to send me the quiz during the week, and then I'll go through some of the answers. I'm not going to put anyone's name on the quizzes, but I'll go through some of the answers, and we'll go through the quizzes every week. And that way, you try to tie what I'm talking about up here to what you're listening to out there. Because one of the things that we found is difficult when we're teaching online like we're trying to do is that there's a disconnect between the conversation that we would normally have if you were in the classroom. So we're going to go through the course of this history. We're going to look at how it impacts us where we are today. We're going to take some quizzes. Now, that talks about the issue of the church. And excuse me, I'm changing notes. The second thing we're going to be talking about is the whole idea of what is the church. One of the things we talk about when we talk about the church, people have this idea that what the church is like this building that we're in right now. It's the place that has a roof over it. It's the place that has the pews. It's the place that has the altar. And nowadays it has the big screen on the back. The church is not the building. You've heard that over and over again. You've heard us say that the church isn't the building, it's the people. Well, it goes even deeper than just the people. You see, what church is, really what church is, it's the relationship that God has with his people. It's the relationship that God has with you. So when we start talking about church history, maybe you're going to think that what we'll do is we'll start in the Gospels, and we'll start right there when Jesus was talking with his disciples and he was establishing the church. Or maybe you might think that we'll start on the day of Pentecost, because that's when the church was really introduced to the world. That's when all the languages were spoken and everyone could hear the gospel in their own language. Maybe that's the beginning of the church. I'm here to give you a different idea. The church actually began in Genesis chapter 1. And that may surprise you, because it's like, well, there's only 2 people in Genesis chapter 1. Well, actually, in Genesis chapter 1, it starts out with 1 person. So just taking you through where I say we begin in studying our church history, we're just going to go through Adam to Noah and then up to Abraham, and introducing the idea of what is church in the context of Adam, Noah, and Abraham. So under Adam, we have the story of the creation. And I encourage you to go ahead, go back to your Bibles and read Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2, and Genesis chapter 3. I think it's interesting when we go back and we start reading Genesis and we get an idea of what happened in the very beginnings of humanity, when we realize that the Bible is a really big book. And if you have a really disciplined read, you'll get through it in a year fairly easy. But as big a book as that is, we only get to the 3rd chapter in the entire book before mankind falls. So we have Genesis chapter 1, which is the creation of the world. Genesis chapter 2 is talking about the relationship of man and Sabbath and God and Adam and Eve all together. And then Genesis chapter 3, it all falls apart. Adam and Eve sin, and sin has entered into the world. So going back, Genesis chapter 1, the very first part of Genesis says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the first sentence. And then it talks about how God created the earth. So the very first sentence is the whole story. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it says, and the earth was void and without form, and the darkness, or the Spirit moved above the darkness. And God said, let there be light. And it was evening and morning the first day, and it was good. So there were 6 days of creation. Day 1 was light. Day 2 was the heavens above, the waters above, and the waters below. So the cloud cover and the oceans. Day 3 was the dry land and the oceans. He separated the dry land from the oceans. That was 1, 2, and 3. Day 4 was the sun, moon, and the stars. Isn't it interesting that light was created and there was no sun, moon, and stars? Now, in our age, a lot of people now today, and I don't know exactly why, but a lot of people in the Christian faith are moving away from the whole idea of science being a legitimate thing. We have a lot of distrust of science. And I'm here to tell you, science is simply this. It's understanding the creation of God. And they don't always get things right. I mean, the things that we believe in science now, just a few years ago, they didn't believe at all. So what science is an exploration of God's creation. So when God said he created light, then he created the clouds above and the oceans below, and then the dry land, and then he created the sun, the moon, the stars, here's what I think happened. I think the Big Bang may have actually happened. And the Big Bang happened when God said, let there be light. Because we know from Einstein, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. If you just have energy and you have matter, but you don't have light, there's no relationship between the elements of creation. That's why the earth was without form and it was void. There was no way to relate all the stuff that's in the universe together. I believe that when God said, let there be light, he actually created E equals MC squared. So creation starts out 1, 2, and 3 is light, oceans or clouds above, oceans below, the dry land. Day number 4 is the birds of the air and the fish in the sea. Isn't it interesting? Or actually, I'm sorry, it's the sun, the moon, the stars. Isn't it interesting that day 1 corresponds to day 4? Because 1 is all about light and 4 is all about the things that make light. Day number 2 was the clouds above and the oceans below. Well, day number 5 was the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. That corresponds to day 2. And day 6 was the creatures that crawl on the earth and mankind. And that corresponds to God creating the dry land. He also created the vegetation, of course, the dry land. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 all created the environment that we live in. And then God said at the end of that, he said morning and evening, first day, 6 times. And then he gets to the 7th day, or the 6th day, and he rests. And it says on the 7th day, going to chapter 2 in Genesis, on the 7th day, that God created the Sabbath. He created rest. He said he rested and made the day holy. So what God did is in the first 6 days, he created the environment, and he created the first covenant. The first covenant, when he created the environment, was when he told Adam this. He said, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and the animals on the land, right? So he had a job to do. He was given the Garden of Eden, and he was told to tend the Garden of Eden. The first job that we were given wasn't to preach, wasn't to teach, it wasn't to raise children, it was to garden. We were designed as gardeners to look over God's creation. So God created the environment for us to live in, and he gave us our first job. And then in Genesis chapter 2, when he creates the Sabbath day, that's the creation of a relationship, because days 1 through 6 had a beginning and end. Every day began and ended. It began and ended, began and ended. And at the end of the 6 days, God rested. But when he created the 7th day, God never said it was evening and morning the 7th day. You see, what happened was this. God created the Sabbath, which was the relationship in which Adam and Eve were supposed to live. Adam and Eve were supposed to live as a resting Sabbath in the Lord for all their lives, and they were going to live forever. It wasn't until the sin came into the world that relationship was severed. So now what we have is we have 1 day of Sabbath. The 7th day of the week is the 1 day of Sabbath we have to remind us of what we lost in the Garden of Eden. It gives us an opportunity to come back in relationship with God. But what I'm getting at in all to say all this is this, that the reality of the church is the relationship of man to God. That's the reality. That's what the church really is. It's a relationship that mankind has with his creator, with her creator. So the creation of the 7th day was the beginning of the church. And in the first church service, honestly, what it was, when it said that in the cool of the morning, Adam would walk with God, that was a church service. It doesn't have to have hymns or drums or music or praise or sermon or communion or any of that. All it has to do is it has to have a person, and it has to have God, and it has to have them together. And that's what church is. Church is a relationship of man to God. Now, in respect to that, the way that was organized, the relationship of man to God in the first church was under what's called a royal grant covenant. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about covenants in the beginning part of Genesis because that's how the church really got started. A royal grant covenant is this. It says, I am giving you something, and here's what you have to do to keep control of that something. If you stop doing what I tell you to do, you no longer have rights to control the thing I've given you. You don't lose it, in other words, but you can't use it. So when God gave Adam and Eve the garden, what he basically said was this, I'm giving you this garden to use, and you're supposed to be in it, and you're supposed to use it, and you're supposed to worship me in it. And if you don't do what I tell you to do, you're going to lose access to the garden. And we know what happens. Adam and Eve fell in Genesis chapter 3, and God threw them out of the garden. And he didn't say, you're not going to be able to use the earth anymore at all. What he said was, the earth isn't going to cooperate with you anymore. So the first covenant, the first agreement that God had with mankind was a royal grant where he gave them the land. And he said, here's what you're supposed to do. That if you stop doing what you're supposed to do, it's not going to work so well for you anymore. So here's what we have in what I'm calling the first church, which is Adam and Eve and their two sons, Cain and Abel. Evil, right? Abel. There we go. There was no church. There was no pews. There were no organs. There were no Leslies running the organs. There were no choirs or any of that kind of stuff. It was just four people, Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. There was no formal ritual. There wasn't any kind of program that they were doing. They just knew who God was, and they abided with him. That's how it worked. And we know the story between Cain and Abel. The very first murder that ever happened because of a disagreement about worship. I mean, how many of you have been in church and have been involved in groups of people that argue about how you're supposed to worship? Well, Cain and Abel argued about worship. Actually, it was more Cain arguing with Abel, not Abel arguing back. But Abel went ahead and he brought some of his flock. He raised animals, and he sacrificed the animals and gave it to God. And a lot of people make a lot of noise about how the fact was that it was supposed to be animals that were sacrificed, and that was the problem. But the issue seemed, if you look deeper into that verse, it says that Abel gave the best of his flock, and Cain gave what he had. So the difference between the two is Abel gave what he loved and cherished. Cain gave just what he had, and he would give it. So God looked favorably on Abel's sacrifice, but unfavorably on Cain's. Why is that? The reason why is that Abel gave what was dear to him, and Cain just gave what he had. When we come to the Lord and we give stuff to him, we're supposed to give him the best of what we have. A lot of people make a lot of a point about giving the first fruits, and they say it's the first money that ever comes into your hands. And I tell people all the time, it's not the first money that comes into your hands. It's the best of what you have that you give back. If you give the offering of Abel, you're giving the best things that you have available to you. If you just give what you've got, you're giving the offering of Cain. God does not accept or honor the offerings that are given just because that's what you have. He honors and he loves the offerings that you give because those are the things that you cherish, and you're giving up the things that you cherish. And the question is why does he want it that way? Why does God want the things that we cherish? And the reason why is this. He gave us the best that he had. So when we give the best that we have, we're emulating our Father. If you're a parent and you're around your kids, you get most excited when your kids start emulating who you are. When they start doing what you do and thinking the way you think, that makes you proud. It makes you excited. So what happens when we give the stuff that we cherish and we give it with a joyful and a willing spirit, God sees his character in us, and it makes him smile, because he's looking at us and saying, that's a person after my own heart. That's why when David was looking out over Jerusalem and the plague was hitting Jerusalem because of the fact that he had done a census and he wasn't supposed to, that he looked out and he saw the angel and he was going to give a sacrifice. And he told a man on this hilltop, he said, let me buy these oxen, and I'm going to buy this hill, and I'm going to make an altar and sacrifice to the Lord to stop the plague. And the man said, just take whatever you want. Just make this plague stop. And David said something very important. He said, I will not give to the Lord something that cost me nothing. So he bought the stuff from the man. He made an altar. He sacrificed to the Lord, and God stopped the plague that was going on. The reason why is because David was acting as a man after God's own heart. He was giving something that he knew was going to cost him personally, but he valued the relationship with God more than the stuff that he was giving him. If that makes sense. If Scott, if you don't mind, I'm going to probably leave it at this point right here. I want you all to be thinking, I want you all to be looking at how you may be able to see the church in the Old Testament. And what we're going to do when we get back together again, I'm going to go ahead and review this section from Adam, through Cain and Abel. Then we're going to talk about Noah. Then we're going to talk about Abraham. So here's what I would like you to do. If you're listening to this broadcast, go ahead and read in Genesis the account of Noah all the way through the Tower of Babel. And then I want you to read Genesis chapter 15 especially. But if you can read all the sections where it talks about Abraham, all the way up to the point where he dies, but read everything you can about Abraham, but particularly Genesis chapter 15, where God makes a covenant with Abraham. Because the first covenant that God made with his people was a royal grant covenant. But the next covenant we're going to talk about is what's called a suzerain vassal covenant. If you want to Google that and look it up, if you want to be students and be ready ahead of time, that's awesome. Go ahead and do it. But next week, we're going to recap Adam to Noah, We're going to talk about Noah to Abraham, and then we're going to talk about Abraham and his covenant. And remember, go ahead and Scott, if you would, put the website up or the email up so people can send requests in, and I'll share my outline with you on Google Docs, and I'll be able to also, we'll send you the quizzes that you'll be responsible for every time we get together. So every Tuesday there's going to be a quiz. Anyway, any questions you might have, any feedback, go ahead and send it to the website that Scott, do you have it up on the screen? Okay, send it in to Scott, and we'll see you next week. There'll be a full 45 minutes. This is just an introduction to get it started. Next week, we'll get started at 5:30, and it'll be a 45-minute class. Study, read, and we'll see you next week.